All right, so throughout lesson 3, your goal is to be able to explain the purpose of what's called a class in computer programming, to be able to define and provide examples of what's called a method in computer programming, then to be able to label and locate those local variables and objects, as well as classes and methods, as well as whether they are local or global for variables and objects, and then to be able to explain the connection between a class, object, and a method, and to be able to explain how classes and methods are like an office building. So we're doing a lot of connections in this unit, actually connecting all the things we've studied so far with what we are currently studying as a new topic between classes and methods. All right, so first we're going to dive in and look at what a class actually is. So a class is actually a template for an object. So there is actually a class for every single object that you come into contact with. And what this class contains is it contains a guideline for the characteristics that each object created from this class should contain. So, for example, every time you create a color object, you are accessing the color class and you're looking at the characteristics that a color object should contain. And you know that it should contain a red, green, and blue intensity value. Then from there, the other part that a class contains is it actually contains all of the methods or the actions that an object can actually complete. So we're going to look at this concept by looking back at the Kodu lessons that we covered last unit and kind of tie in a part of the Kodu class. But at this basic level, all a class is a template for an object, and it has all of the methods inside of it that have the code for all of the little actions that your object can do. And then it has a basic characteristics list that those objects must contain. All right, so we're going to talk about classes in terms of the Kodu programming software that we used last chapter to kind of discuss what the template of an object or a class will contain. So we're going to look at the Kodu itself. You use the Kodus in a couple of different programs that we created. And for every Kodu, it had a list of characteristics. Now, I could not possibly list all of the characteristics of a Kodu on this slide. So I picked some of the more important ones or some of the ones that you may have used. And every single Kodu had a list of characteristics. And now these characteristics varied by Kodu. So I know when we made the racing game, you may have given your Kodu that you controlled a different speed compared to the Kodu of the computer. Or you may have given your Kodu an emotion when its health fell below a certain value, or your Kodu may have been blue and the computer may have been green. You also could change the size, you could increase the health potentials. Every Kodu has a list of characteristics, and they have every single characteristic fulfilled. And then you can make your Kodu unique based on these characteristics. But every Kodu has that list of characteristics, and these characteristics are just like the characteristics that are in the template of an object called a class. So every Kodu, the Kodu class essentially outlines that a Kodu must have all of these characteristics. The other piece is that the Kodu class also contains the code for all of the actions that a Kodu may do. So whenever we create a Kodu, every Kodu has the ability to do these things. So every Kodu can do these actions. And so these are methods, and we'll talk about methods again in a second, but these are the actions a Kodu can do. So every single class has a list of characteristics for an object of that type that the object must contain, and it contains the code for all of the actions that the objects created from that class type can do. So just to kind of give you an outline of class one more time, the generic Kodu class template is the template from which all Kodus are created. So that's the big thing there. A class, you'll see, is a template from which all objects of that type are created. And in this case, it was a Kodu. Then all Kodu have the actions or methods that are listed in that class that they can do. So keep in mind, methods are things that your object can do. They are the actions. And then from there, they also list all the characteristics that the Kodu will have. But these characteristics will vary as each Kodu is different. So What I mean by this is one code whose characteristic for color may be blue, while one code whose characteristic for color may be red. So remember, the class is a template from which all objects are created. Now, as I stated previously when we talked about objects, there are many built-in classes in MonoGame. And color, sprite patch, gamepad state, keyboard, you're already coming into contact with a couple of them. These are all built in, and I will show you how to use these and access all of the built-in methods as well as access the different characteristics for each object that we create of those types. Now, as I've said before, you can also build your own classes so that you can create objects out of those classes. So keep that in mind. While there are a lot built in, it is not uncommon to have to create your own class as well. So whether or not you realize it, the first class that you come into contact with when you start creating a program in MonoGame is the Game 1 class. And you'll see this at the very, very beginning of your program. It'll say Game 1 class. You can see that in there. And truly, that is the first class that we work with in MonoGame. And first I want to talk about the actions. There are 5 main methods or actions that our game can do. And these are actually the tidbits of code that our game class can run. So we have the initialize method, the load content method, the unload content method, the update method, and the draw method. And these are the actions of this class, and they are the things that our class can do. Now, the other piece of it is our class actually contains numerous characteristics, whether or not you realize it. So all of the global objects and the global variables that we declare actually become characteristics of our game class. They are things that our game that we are creating contains. So depending on the type of game you make, you will have different characteristics that your game needs, whether it's a counter or the number of lives or whatnot. So notice that when we're working with the game class, we have numerous characteristics, and then we have 5 main methods that our class can run. Now, I keep using this word method, and I do want to take a minute to touch on what the word method means. A method is an action that an object of a class can run. So I like to think of methods as what are called miniature programs, because truly there are miniature programs that have a specific task, and we write these purposefully. So one example that you'll see in Unit 4 is you'll see this method called getState. And getState is a method from the gamepad class. And what this method does, and the code that's written for it, is this method will take in a specific gamepad. So whether you want it to look at pad 1, 2, 3, or 4. And what this method does is it will get the state of the setting of all of the gamepad pieces. So it'll look at the buttons, it'll look at the joystick, it'll look at the triggers. And what this method really does is it gets the state of all of these things and it sends it back to your program. So every time that you use this method, you use this little bit of pre-built code that has a specific task, is it will go and it will find the settings of that program. So keep in mind, a method is basically a mini program with a very specific task. And we like to use these methods because they allow us to essentially do the same thing multiple times, but just use that one little section of code. So we want to get the state of a gamepad a lot. We want to constantly be checking it. So instead of writing that code every single time, we would rather just use the getState method and use that code in an efficient manner where we reuse it every time we want to find the state of gamepad. So keep in mind, a method is just an action an object can do, and it is a mini program that has a very, very specific task. So the next key word that you'll hear when we're talking about methods is you'll hear the words parameter list. And all methods have some sort of parameter list. Now they can have no parameters that they take in, that's completely possible, but some methods take in multiple parameters. And what parameters are, they are variables or objects, or both, depending on how many parameters you need, that contain the information that a method needs to do its job. So on the previous page I talked about the getState method and how we can access this method and it can find the state of a gamepad, but the getState method actually takes in one parameter, and it takes in information that it needs in order to do its job. So, for example, when you're playing a video game, you can have up to 4 controllers, and if we just called the getState method, we actually wouldn't know which gamepad 1, 2, 3, or 4, we should be looking at. So what happens is when we use the getState method, we actually need to send in one piece of information, and we need to send in which pad we want to find the state of. If we don't tell it we want it to find pad 1, pad 2, pad 3, pad 4, etc., it won't know which gamepad to look at. So parameter list is basically all that the method needs to know to do its job. And you'll see that a method needs to know in order to complete the action and do its job. Without this information, the method can't do what you're asking it to do. So every time you call a method, you need to be aware of its parameter list. What information do you need to send in? Whether it's an integer, whether it's an object, whatever it may be, what information does your method need to get its job done? So as I stated on the previous slide, remember that a method is basically a miniature program that will do a specific action for you. And remember that these are located inside of a class. So in order to use a method, in order to use these mini programs, in monogame or in the language of C#, we will use what is called the dot method. And the idea behind this is that in order to access this method, we first have to write down the class that it is in, because every method is located within a class. It is an action of some type of object. So you put your class name, and then the dot is basically telling you, this little dot right here, the dot method is saying go inside of this class, and then the dot is telling you, and then look for this particular method name. It's saying go into this class, look for this method name, and you're going to use this method, and this list right here contains all of the possible parameters, so all of the variables and or objects that you will need to use this method. So we use the dot method, the class name, dot, the method name, and then you include the list of parameters. So here are a couple of examples of what calling a method will look like. And so I just want to reiterate what I said on the previous slide. So here we have the class that the method is located in. We then have the dot telling us, okay, go look inside of this class. And then here we have our method. We're using the getState method, and it takes in one parameter, and you're telling it to look at player 1. Then you see the same pattern down below inside of the keyboard class. And then we have the dot. Is the method is key down, and we're sending in one parameter of keys.b, so we know we're looking at the B key. You see that same pattern in the next chunk. Again, we have the graphics device class dot. We need to look for inside of the graphics device class the clear method, and that takes in a color object, and here we're sending in the color green. So we're going to clear the screen to the color green. Now, these three examples up above all contained one single parameter. However, you can contain no parameters, or you can contain multiple parameters. So for example here, you can go into the keyboard class, and you can in fact access the getState method. And what you notice here is it says keyboard dot getState, and then it has no parameters. The parentheses with no parameters say that we're going to get the state of the keyboard, and we don't need any additional pieces of information to do our job. And then in this last one, and actually I forgot a little piece here, this should say rectangle dot intersection. This is out of the rectangle class. You have the intersection method, and then you take in rectangle 1 and rectangle 2. So kind of miswrote that one right there. You can look at that right below. So you have the rectangle class where the intersection method is located, and we take in 2 parameters. So you have to read each method as is. Okay, what type of method, or where is this method located? That's in the class. What is this method called? And then what parameters, how many parameters, if any parameters, will this method in fact take in? And this will be the pattern you will see over and over and over again as we start to use a lot of built-in methods that we are finding in monogame. So there's your little crash course on classes and methods.